Hi, this is my Paul Lanier with Immersion Talks. And as we're looking at this conference coming up, the symposium coming up, Holy Blood, Holy Blade, we've been talking to our various ambassadors on their histories and the histories of the regions, the weapons and the tactics in a broad range of open format, long conversations. So one of the big regions that is often ignored in the world is the influence of Northern Africa and the Near East and what they had on the development of both the culture in Europe and the development of weapons all around Europe. So today we have two scholars who are focused, two scholars and two martial artists who are focused on this particular region. And we're just going to have an open conversation on what on earth is going on there for those 700-800 years. What is the development of the history, the development of those weapons, the development of those strategies as we go there. So again, these are unscripted, free-flowing exchange of ideas. So with that, Adam, welcome aboard, and Frank, welcome aboard.
Hey.
So guys, let's talk a little bit about Northern Africa and its influence on the whole region of Andalusia and that 700-800 years of history that most people have either not been taught or forgotten, or just, in my view, has been systematically being erased. So can we jump into that? Where do you want to take off, Adam?
Okay, sure. I mean, so most people are fairly familiar with the Islamic expansion in the 8th century. 711, Tariq bin Zayed crosses, the Strait of Gibraltar, and the story of Andalusia begins. One of the things that I think is important to note is that people often sort of slide into this idea that Andalusia was an Arab kingdom or a singular Arab sort of, it was a singular Arab civilization, I should say. But they lose the understanding that Andalusia was, from its outset, a multicultural kingdom. And what I mean by that is, when it was part of the Umayyad Caliphate, the Arab people, ethnic Arabs, actually formed a minority, I believe it's the Beni Umayyads, and they were represented sort of a political and religious elite. But the vast majority of their armies that had moved into Andalusia were, especially in the 8th century, were converts to Islam from Northern Africa, which previously was Christian. And many of the indigenous Iberians were converted to Islam. So that's where you have groups like the Masárabes and Moriscos and other groups of people who sort of eventually became part of that civilization. So then you also have this class of Sephardic Jews, or the Sephardim, who represented another important part of the civilization, who contributed things like poetry, they contributed to the economics, they contributed to the politics. So Andalusia wasn't just sort of, it was Arab speaking, as in Arabic was the lingua franca, because it was easier as the language of administration, it was easier to communicate with other places in the Islamic world. The written language was a bit more developed and universal than the various Amazigh languages, because as we look at a group that people often call the Berbers, it was the real term is Amazigh, and Amazigh people are very diverse. There's a multitude of these groups, and they all speak their own languages, which are related but not the same. So it only made sense for them to have one lingua franca, and that being Arabic, which was sort of a third-party language, if you will.
Just want to say real quick, thank you for pointing out the switch to Amazigh. As someone who has Amazigh ancestry, I just want to say I appreciate that. We're tired of the word Berber. Thank you.
Well, and sort of that's sort of the whole part of it, right? And then sort of the idea that the Al-Andalus was all unified after the breakdown of the Umayyad Caliphate, which actually part of that started off with a revolt by the Amazigh people in the western part of North Africa, or the Maghreb, because they were tired of being essentially oppressed by the Arabs who represented the political and religious elite class. So then there was that breaking part. And then in Andalusia itself, after a couple of centuries, now you have the unified Al-Andalus breaking down into all of these different taifas, which are essentially city-states. And so for most of Al-Andalus's history, it wasn't even one kingdom. It was multiple kingdoms that often had alliances with Christians against each other, or would help Christians in their wars against each other as well. So the idea that, so I'll tie this rant off with two things. The first thing being the idea that Al-Andalus was an Arab civilization. It was just Arabic speaking because that was the lingua franca, and it was just easier for people to communicate. And two, that it was one kingdom for all 800 years, which it wasn't. It was multiple different kingdoms that allied against each other in different ways. And finally, that the idea of the Reconquista is, in many ways, I believe, at least, a bit of a myth, in that it wasn't a singular unified front of Christians fighting against the Muslims to push them out of Iberia. It was several centuries of alliances between Muslim and Christian kingdoms that eventually led to the downfall of the Andalusian civilization and giving rise to the Spanish Empire. Frank, do you want to step in?
No, I just want to say completely, wholeheartedly, agree with all of this. But another nuance that I want to, not nuance, another point I want to add to that is it wasn't even necessarily just like broader alliances in terms of warfare and diversity, right? Too, people look at Andalusia as, the gateway of medicine and architecture too, coming in to Europe, right? And people often want to credit that as being like, look, the Arabs brought medicine, the Muslims brought medicine into Europe. Like most of the caliphates after them and being established, most doctors in the caliphates were actually Christians. So it was not Muslims bringing this medicine into Europe. It was local or transplanted Christians that came in. Like most of the doctors in Syria, for example, which is one of the most important Islamic centers in the caliphate's history, most of these doctors were Christian. And a lot of your local craftsmen were Jewish. There was a large Jewish population in Andalusia and Spain as well. So I just want to extend that thought a little bit, that it wasn't just militarily where this diversity was existing and politically, it was also socially and culturally. So we could break down a little bit these preconceived notions that just because like Muslims were ruling the empire, it doesn't necessarily mean that the Muslims did everything in that empire. And that's pretty much it.
No, I think that's fair enough. I think most people don't know about the Northern African and Arab influence in general, leave along the idea that these were pretty much independent city-states, for the lack of a better term, that were constantly at war. But what is just mostly remembered is Queen Isabella and the beginning of the expansion of the Spanish empires. So a little more about how did these some of these weird alliances come into play, right? Because you have Andalusia, and in some ways you have an alliance almost a reverse crescent shape, starting from, say, the Middle East today, right, coming all the way down into Northern Africa. How did these come into being, and what was the reason for that super sudden expansion of power, if you will?
Well, if we want to talk about the sudden expansion of the Umayyad Caliphate, I mean, there are a couple of things that we have to consider. One of the things to consider is the idea that we'll start with the whole story really starts in the Arabian Peninsula, and the idea that all of these different groups of, all these different tribes, all these different city-states, finally had a unifying force. For the longest time, Arabs, as we would describe them, lived by the system known as Ghazwa. Ghazwa is kind of like, I need something and you have it, so I'm going to raid your camp and I'm going to take it. I mean, this is where we get heroes like Muqtada bin Shaddad. He fought his first battle fighting against somebody who was raiding his village or his settlement. So now you have all of these groups of people who come together, and they now have this new empire of these experienced warriors who have lived in very challenging conditions, that are also now backed with all of these city-states that have recently converted to Islam. who have all of this economic power to put behind them. Then you have the perfect storm of the Byzantines and the Sasanians, who had basically worn themselves out fighting for, God knows how long over territory. So now what happens is the Sasanians have spent all of their money in years fighting wars against the Byzantines, and the same for the Byzantines. So now they don't have the capacity to fight against this new, vigorous, motivated kingdom. So I give the example of the invasion that happened in Egypt in the 640s. The Egyptians, so there are a couple of stories. So Egypt was part of the Byzantine Empire and was largely Christian up until about the 7th century. And when the Egyptian governor basically reaches out to Constantinople and says, help, they're basically saying, well, we're tied up in Syria, or we are tied up, we don't have the forces because we just finished fighting the Sasanians. And so now Egypt was left to fend for itself. And because Egypt was left to fend for itself and it didn't necessarily have the material support that it would have had, especially considering that the style of warfare that the Arabs brought to the table was different from what they were used to when fighting the Persians, because that influence from Persia hadn't been as strong until Persia later gets absorbed into the Islamic Empire. They really just didn't have the resources to fight back. And the same thing happens in North Africa. And so the interesting part is, and I have to be very careful about how I say this, because I don't want to say that Arabs and Amazigh people are the same, but because the horse culture, the weapons culture, and the sort of the resistance against the Byzantines and some theological ideas were similar enough that conversions of Amazigh to Islam happened fairly quickly. Especially since many of them, but you still had a lot of resistance. Like you had Puidahya, you had the leopard of Al-Taba, who also fought very heavily against these bending Islamic empires. But in comparison, you have these relatively small kingdoms fighting against this force that basically keeps snowballing and gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And eventually they end up collapsing simply because they just don't have the capacity to resist. It's almost like if you weigh 98 pounds and now all of a sudden you're fighting a guy who out of nowhere comes out and he's 200 pounds, and there really isn't a lot you can do at that size. So that sort of feeds into it. Then these forces that are newly converted, experienced soldiers, now get absorbed into the armies. And there's also this idea of people basically being given the option of converting or dying, or converting or paying the tax. And for some people, they decided that conversion was a much easier prospect than dying on the battlefield or having to pay a tax. So they converted for political reasons, and then eventually you have that growth. So that's my piece on the rapid expansion.
Yeah, I was also just about to piggyback literally on something that you already just said about the jizya and being taxed as well, right? Conversion went in two separate directions. You had some areas, the people living near the city centers, the established centers, who decided, yes, conversion is a good idea, and that happened relatively quickly, but it was barely because of this idea of things being forced or at the sword. Well, yes, I'm certain it did happen in the early days. Like you were saying about not having enough resources, it was actually more beneficial to leave some populations not Muslim, because if you weren't Muslim, you could keep your religion but pay the jizya, and if you pay the jizya, that means you don't have to fight in battles if you don't want to. It means that you are protected, and your minority ruling class gets income they need to continue to expand. So there are some areas where it was actually better for them to not want conversion to happen. And you see that a lot. Especially in the more settled city centers. That's just one little bit of nuance that I wanted to throw onto that. I'll go ahead and mute myself now.
Fair enough. So what we're seeing is expansion, and I'm again generalizing just so people get the idea. Expansion at both one for political, religious political reasons, this rapidly growing on one end, and on the other end, the military might, just like Adam was saying, the snowball effect, and these new armies and new groups being absorbed, and when they're fighting little kingdoms, they don't stand a chance in hell. So we saw this rapid expansion. Let's get into more of the military, and more of how these raiding parties, how these groups grew. What do we know? What can you share about from your research through these years on the battle strategies, the way they went to fight? What were the weapons, what were some of the strategies and tactics that were common during those years of rapid expansion, going all the way into modern day Andalusia?
Horses, 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 and more horses. Did I mention horses? Anybody who studied classical Arabic culture knows that there was a real love for equestrianism. There were some really great books on the entire lineage of horses, just to show you how important cavalry was. So essentially, there was sort of this idea of lightning fast attacks. So you come in with your horses, you cut them down with your swords, do everything. It basically is about being fast and light and mobile. So that was the general approach. So by the time the next village hears that you've just finished with this village, you're already halfway there. Then, of course, there was, I'm just trying to think about the battle at Fortress Babylon. That was mostly like a cavalry-based battle. Even though it was, it was a siege, there was a lot of clashing of forces between the Byzantine and the Arab forces. And the Arab forces not focusing on having heavy cavalry like cataphracts, they were able to move around on the battlefield a lot faster and get to certain positions, encirclements, and all of these other different approaches to fighting. But in short, to stop the babbling, it was all about being fast and mobile, and being able to position your soldiers in the right place at the right time before the people that you are fighting against have time to cooperate. And there was a lot of influence from the Byzantines. In fact, the swords that were used by the early Islamic warriors fairly represented the Roman spada and other weapons like that. The Mamluks, for example, have a sword that they call the Sword of the Prophet, which looks not too different from a Byzantine straight sword of the period. So in terms of their weapons, they were heavily influenced more so by the Byzantines than the Sasanians. And you can also see that in some of their treatises. There's one movement actually called the Syrian bloc. It's in this text called Mihyat al-Sul. And it says specifically in the text that it was a movement that was adopted from the Roman Syrians, or from the Rum, as they would call them. Frank, do you want to chime in?
I was actually getting ready to pull up a picture from there's a smith that I use a lot. A lot of my armor is from him, and he has a really good reproduction of a sword that was common to both Arabia and the Byzantine Empire. And I'm just trying to pull that up. So give me a second to grab that, and this actually might be a good visual comparison. If that's okay, I just want to make sure I give him some credit when I pull it up. So 1 second.
Yeah, please feel free to share anything you want.
Of course. So then, while Frank is looking for that, there's also the idea of being disciplined with multiple weapons. I go back to the example of Antara bin Shaddad. For those who aren't familiar with him, he was a 6th and 7th century warrior, also called the Black Crow, and also known as the father of all knights. He was the son of an enslaved Ethiopian woman and an Arab nobleman. And in short, after a battle that he had fought, he became, a knight. And if you look at all of the different depictions of him, you see that he carries 3 weapons with him. He has 4. So he has a shamshir. In his time, actually, swords from India were actually quite popular in Arabia. So he would carry curved swords, or the images show him carrying curved swords, likely made by the Guptas. He carried a lance, he carried a bow, and he carried a khanjar or a jambiya. And that was essentially sort of the weapon kit. If you were a higher class knight, warrior, etc., then you would have all of these things, or at some point you would have some combination of those weapons to carry with you. Okay, so Frank's got the image, so I'll pass the floor to him.
So the one that we're gonna have on the screen is actually from a find in Egypt, actually, but it's a really interesting kind of a case study in a lot of cultures. And a lot of cultures meeting is it has that long spatha type blade, but it actually has a developed crossguard, which I believe that actually shows a little bit of Sasanian and Persian influence.
Frank,
If you look at
Frank,
some
the image is not opening up on my computer. So if you want to just share it and press the share button.
Yeah, good idea. Usually Zoom etiquette that I'm used to, the host shares everything. So hold on. All right, I'm sharing. Oh, it says host disabled participant sharing. If I can, I'll get it up on my phone if you can't figure it out.
No, go ahead. I think you should be able to do it.
All right, is it coming up?
Not yet.
All right. My days teaching high school on Zoom are coming back to haunt me. All right, there we go. All right, so yes, so here it is. So you see it has a very like typical spatha, type long blade. But you see there is like a developed crossguard on it, which actually shows a little bit of that Sasanian influence too coming in, because you see some really early Sassanid swords that do have completely fully developed crossguards coming into it, because it actually was not long at all before this that the Persians were actually ruling Egypt. It was the Byzantines that that took it back. So this is actually a lot of cultural blending in here. And I pointed out to a lot of people when I mentioned that early swords in North Africa and the Middle East, they weren't these really long, deeply curved swords that everyone thinks that they are, because those didn't come to like way later. So I just want to point out like really how more traditionally you might think like European this sword looks to like the general populace who's watching this right now.
Yeah, this looks like a spada to me,
Yeah. And one thing I want to note about this piece is I think the smith might have gotten a little wrong, was that this piece right here actually isn't part of the crossguard. That's part of the scabbard. And sometimes what'll happen is in museums, they just have to leave the top part of the scabbard, the upper, like it's not a chape, but I'm drawing a blank on what it's called, but these fittings that enclose the scabbard, they fuse to the crossguard when they're uncovered. So what I believe is happening here is that this part that I'm circling here is actually just part of the crossguard, but they recreated it that way for some reason. The smith does amazing work. This just might have been a small oversight in that development. Does that make sense?
Yep.
All right, cool. Yeah, moving on. I just want to make sure we had visual comparison.
So Adam, do you want to get back to carrying out the multiple weapons? You were just going over that.
Yeah. So basically, a fetis or a high class knight.
Frank, can you stop sharing, Frank, so we can?
Yeah, just trying to pull up. I'm just trying to pull up the. Trying to pull up. I can't find the. Here I'm embarrassing myself online. I can't find the. I can't find the quote right there. Stop share. Got it. All right, I'm good.
There we go. Okay.
Yeah.
So generally, the idea of the fetis or the knight, fetis, which is the root word of photosia, would have to be able to use multiple different weapons in battle. Sort of the same idea of like a if I want to give a comparison, think about a samurai. A samurai would need to be able to use a yari, would need to be able to use a katana, would need to be able to use a yumi, would need to be able to use a wakizashi, and be able to use a tanto, right? And it's the same idea with apprentice. They need to be able to use the safe, they need to be able to use the lance, they need to be able to use the bow, and sometimes on horseback, especially that came with later influence from the Turks and the Persians. Obviously they need to be able to use the jembiya or hunja.
Hey, I think this gives us a pretty good idea as we start to jump into in our next podcast, specifically around the weapons and how those develop coming in. So that I want to thank Adam and Frank for these first podcast, and see you guys shortly.
For some, it's the quest of an empire. For some, it's been the quest of power and riches. For some, the quest for honor. And yet for others, the quest for freedom. Blades and bladecraft have done just that. So Richard Burton has said, the history of the sword is the history of mankind. And that's the journey we are on. No blade culture has defined the world as much as the Spanish bladecraft. And yet, no art develops in a vacuum. It is shaped by those that it interacts and fights with, and also shapes the cultures whether they are conquered or manage to maintain their freedom. In this particular lab, we're going to look at how Spanish bladecraft influenced arts across the 5 continents. We've traversed 20,000 plus miles. Wharton teaches with over 700 years of combined bladecraft experience. Together in one place at one time, where over 3 days and 40 hours of non-stop training, you will be able to see and experience firsthand how it shaped Europe, how it shaped the bladecraft of Northern Africa, how it developed the arts, both indigenous and otherwise, in Philippines. Moving over to Latin America, from the jungles of Colombia and Panama, how the arts of machete developed. Coming further up north, looking at the arts of the southwest Mexicali region, where the long bullwhip was developed. Or looking at the development of a very American form of fighting, the Bowie bladecraft. The impact on the Asian martial arts itself, with the Chinese art being completely transformed by fencing and fencing footwork. Lastly but not the least, is looking at the biomechanics of what full contact bladecraft does, how it shapes your movement and what works and what doesn't work. This is the experiment we embark on. The lucky few who come here will get a view of 500 years of bladecraft that developed across 5 continents, and the relationship between the conquerors and the conquered, between the wannabe conquerors and the freedom fighters, between those who fought as pirates and those who fought to maintain their honor. This is that experiment. This is Holy Blood, Holy Blade. For more information,